Amplitude Studios have created a universe that has felt the mark of an advanced civilization. This advanced civilization was able to traverse the universe. They were able to colonize wondrous planets, unlock mysteries, the mysteries of science, and they were able to redefine what it is to have a soul. This advanced civilization is gone now, having left behind only derelict ruins and the mysterious dust. The civilizations of endless space struggle and strive to understand who the Endless were by repairing their wonders and hoarding as much dust as they can, as hostile as it can sometimes be. But progress to understanding who the Endless actually were tends to be quite slow throughout the game, so that's what we'll do today. We'll find out who are the Endless. So, first off, we know the Endless came from an icy planet called Tor due to the introduction that the Pilgrim race gives us in the game Endless Space.
They cross the stars to find more systems, more ruins, to find Tor, homeworld of the Endless. And their charismatic and passionate leader will never abandon this quest.
So the Endless weren't always called the Endless. They came from the planet Tor and therefore called themselves the Taurians. And the Taurians split into 3 different cultures that eventually become the Endless. They are the Tandu, equatorial farmers and city builders; Hayden, the nomadic hunter-gatherers that cross the equator when the ice melts, allowing for them to cross a land bridge; and the Ear, deep sea dwellers, city builders and explorers. These 3 cultures were only peripherally aware of each other during their early development, and therefore they progressed individually. The Tandu were philosophical, the Hayden became scientific, and the Ear were industrious. Despite the struggles of surviving on a planet filled with predators, these 3 cultures joined together to form a single identity, called the Taurians. The Taurians were very aware of how dangerous scientific progress could be, and so they created a piece of legislation that limited that scientific progress, and this was called the Teian. As progress was by law slow, their steps into space were quite steady. However, interplanetary travel was inevitable, and the exploitation of heavenly bodies was achieved. It was at this time that the discovery of sentient life was made. A crystal-like rock was discovered by a Taurian called Ruaral Bay on an asteroid that had a scientific lab built upon it. After preliminary tests, Ruaral Bay discovered that the crystal rock actually reacted to external stimuli. They discovered that the rock was able to consume energy and change its physical shape. Now, not only had the sentience of the rock been assured, but the fact that it had been sentient and all other rocks like it, they had all been sentient since the beginning of time. This crystal-like rock form became known as the Harmony. As time passed, the Taurians were able to achieve greater things in space. They were able to colonize planets, moons, and asteroids far from Tor. The inhabitants of these colonies lived there for so long that generations went by that had never seen Tor, and therefore, these people did not identify themselves as Taurians. It's at this point in the development of the Endless that the identity of the Taurian disappeared. They banded together and became the Endless. Let us look back at Tor for a moment. Tor had not lost its significance to the Endless, it still remained their collective homeworld. However, scientific and industrial progress had gone to the extent that the Teian had feared it would exceed. The Ear had been developing deep-sea mining techniques that required heavy tools and even explosives. Now imagine explosives in the deep seas just to acquire minerals. The significant and increasing loss of rock at the seabed destabilized the crust of Tor. Tor was now in its final moments. The Ear needed evacuating. Anyone on Tor needed evacuating because Tor was terminal. But why the Ear in particular? Because the Tandu and Hayden had proved most adaptable to space life. Due to the Ear's genetic makeup, that being that they are deep sea dwellers and require water to breathe their air, and their bodies are far more used to higher pressures, developing spaceships or space stations or anywhere for them to live outside Tor was incredibly difficult. A few were able to be evacuated to a hollowed out asteroid filled with ice from Tor that had then been melted. But unfortunately, the significant majority of Eir were lost when Tor was destroyed. The hollowed out asteroid was not a permanent solution. The Eir needed to adapt to space life. They could not live in an asteroid for the rest of their existence. Scientists began to work towards changing Eir genetic makeup. Some of the Endless considered this a blessing, an ability to live outside of Tor. Others, however, thought this was a perversion. What follows on from this is what is called the Wars of Alteration. Many lives were lost during the Wars of Alteration, but there was no distinct winner. As with any war, travesties occurred. Those that supported Alteration attacked a police barracks that was holding a pro-Alteration doctor hostage. The attack burned out the oxygen systems and killed everyone in the area. Equally, an anti-Alteration demonstrator placed breaching charges on the edge of the asteroid that Eir were inhabiting. The explosion killed those around it and created a suction hole into the vacuum of space, and thousands were killed. Eventually, however, alteration was achieved. The species of the Eir became no more. As had been said previously, the Endless were beginning to travel across the stars and colonize other planets. During this time, just after the Wars of Alteration, a planet was discovered called Kairos. Kairos was what is considered an Eden planet, a planet that was capable of supporting life and all kinds of life. The discovery of Kairos soon became the new Tor to some of the Endless. It in fact became almost a mecca to some of the Endless religions. However, achieving spaceflight and crossing the stars did not enlighten some. Just as Jerusalem has seen its fair share of bloodshed, Kairos would see it too. So the Endless religions gathered on Kairos, their new holy land. A new religion was made, in fact, by a man named Coil. This religion was called Kairos is Paradise. However, this mix of religions created instability. Coil, despite his desires to keep Kairos safe and protected, was a factor in the war that would destroy Kairos. Kairos unfortunately burned in the wars. It went from being an Eden planet to being a planet that could no longer support life. The destruction of Kairos was a realization to the Endless. They realized they needed to control colonization even more than the Taian had dictated. They created a new legislation called They Must Be Remembered, in which colonization was only achievable after decades of long-term analysis. They were only allowed to create observation posts from moons that surrounded these planets. This extended distance from planets, and therefore growing up on spaceships and moons and asteroids, affected their genetic makeup. They became different from the Taurians that had once taken the first steps into space. It was at this point that dust was created. Dust had first developed as a tool to help the Eir adapt to space life. It had been used to help them breathe with their gills. However, dust became smaller and smaller and smaller and was able to self-replicate and self-network, and this is where it became identified as dust. The use of dust is actually unknown, because the civilizations of Endless Space are unaware of how the Endless used dust. Therefore, we are actually unaware. We're in the same position as the civilizations from Endless Space. We're trying to figure out what dust was actually used for. However, dust is not always useful. Not only will the history of the Endless show us this, but the fact that heroes who gain supernatural powers from dust in some situations can also have themselves destroyed by it. Ultimately, dust was progression to the Endless. They had been able to create true AI. Dust had a form of consciousness, and so the next step to some Endless was to take consciousness from a biological being and put it in something that could not age. The concept of virtualization was created. A discovery like this does not have a single scientist who discovered all of it, but there is a scientist who can be accredited to having progressed it the most. Her name is Autam Spatora. Spatora's passion for her work was able to win the adoration of a leading Endless figure called Ikariel, who was the captain of a refugee ship filled with ear. Ikariel's abdication from his captain post on this refugee ship earned him the entreatying of a lot of ear asking him to come back. He eventually couldn't take saying no anymore and killed himself by asking Dust to alter Spatora's medical equipment, remove his organs, and leave them in stasis. This was the final key in Spatora's work to try and unlock the meanings of the soul. Spatora's work, and the work of other scientists as well, achieved virtualization, and virtualization represented the end of death. Death was no longer the ultimate foe. But what is there to do if there is no death at the end of it? We'd like to think that the end of death would create a more philosophical existence. However, the end of death for the Endless created a more thrill-seeking society. Virtualization wasn't taken by all Endless, but by the Endless who did choose to virtualize themselves. They were more concerned with how they could gain more power. Life was endless, and so they needed more. Some Endless that chose not to virtualize themselves, such as the Malkali, who preserved the ruins of Kairos in penance for what actually happened there, decided that they could not virtualize themselves. They needed to atone for the actions of those on Kairos by physical work. This created a distinction. Those who were virtualized and therefore did not have biological bodies, and those who did. This distinction, this polarization, created the virtuals and the concretes. Now, it's easy to think that because they identified themselves as Endless, that their existence as a group was harmonious, but it wasn't. The Endless were constantly having internal conflicts, because that is just how it is when there are actually billions and trillions of you around space. However, this distinction between virtual and concrete made larger groups out of people, and they threw themselves into conflict. The greatest war of Endless history began. It is known as the War of Virtualization, or the Dust Wars. Remember when I said that Endless history was going to show that dust was not always a good thing? The Endless, in this war, weaponized dust. Not only this, but the Virtuals raised a civilization that they had deemed incapable of becoming a true civilization. They raised one of the endless space civilizations, the Cravers. Now, I will explain who the Cravers are in a future episode, but to put it very shortly, the Cravers consume planets. The concretes weaponizing dust to eradicate AI and therefore erase virtual consciousness. The Virtuals are not innocent in this weaponization of dust as well. They were able to develop it so that it would destroy life systems. But the Cravers were able to destroy planets of the concrete. The Virtual was so disgusted by what the Cravers were capable of that they left them on a arid planet and tried to destroy them by nuking it. The Dust Wars was so destructive that a lot of the Endless were lost. The civilization of the Endless was now splintered. A lot of concrete went and lived alone, secluded. The same for the virtuals. The Endless civilization was near its end. By the time of Endless Space, the Endless are now gone. The only thing that can be supposed by this is that the splintering slowly killed off the Endless. This is a very sad tale, I believe, filled with tragic lore, but I would very much recommend people go and look for this lore in other places as well. You can go on to the Amplitude forums, and there is a post, a series of posts in fact, that deals with the lore of the Endless. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and come back again next time for when we talk about who the Cravers are, and whether the Cravers are in fact the necrophage from Endless legend. I hope you have enjoyed yourselves, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye bye!